Picture this. It is the morning of the 8th of March 1991. Somewhere on a sunlit runway in Mallorca, a family from Birmingham is waiting at the departure gate. Their bags are checked, their seats are booked, they have spent their last pesetas. But the gate never opens. Instead, a member of staff appears with a printed statement, cold and clinical, and reads out the words that would ruin the holidays of 25,000 British travellers all at once. We regret to announce that all services are suspended until further notice. No warning, no refunds at the desk, no explanation beyond 4 lines of corporate language, just silence, and a crowd of confused, sunburned British tourists stranded across the beaches of Europe with nowhere to go. The airline that did this to them was not some fly-by-night operation. This was Air Europe, Britain's largest independent airline. A company that, just months earlier, had been operating 700 flights a week out of British airports. A company that controlled 20% of all takeoff and landing slots at London Gatwick, more than any other short-haul carrier. A company with a fleet of brand new jets, profitable routes, and over 3.5 million passengers a year. And it was gone. In a single morning. What you are about to hear is not just the story of an airline that went bust. It is the story of how Britain came closer than most people realized to having its own low-cost aviation revolution, 15 years before EasyJet made it look easy. It is the story of a man who built something genuinely extraordinary, and then bet everything on a world that refused to stay still. And it is the story of what happens when ambition outruns capital, and a war nobody saw coming finishes the job. If you were alive in Britain in the 1980s, you may remember booking a holiday and stepping onto one of these planes. The livery was bold, the seats felt modern, the meals were included, at a time when that actually meant something on a charter flight. Air Europe felt different from the tired old charter experience. It felt like the future. It was the future, just not for long enough. Stay with me, because the full story of Air Europe is more complicated and more revealing than most people know. And the details, when you see them laid out, will make you wonder how close it all came to turning out completely differently. To understand what Air Europe was, you need to understand what Britain's holiday industry looked like in the 1970s and the gap it was desperate to fill. By the middle of that decade, British working families had developed a genuine appetite for Mediterranean sunshine. Spain, Greece, Portugal, Italy, the dream of a fortnight abroad had gone from luxury to expectation remarkably quickly. But the charter airline market was a mess. Aging aircraft, overcrowded planes, companies cutting corners on everything that didn't show on a brochure. Into this world stepped Harry Goodman. If there is one name you need to remember from this story, it is his. Goodman was not a pilot. He was not an engineer. He was a trader, an East End entrepreneur who had started in travel agencies and built Intersourn into one of Britain's most aggressive package tour operators. In 1973, when one of the UK's largest tour operators collapsed, Goodman moved immediately. He reserved the failed company's hotel rooms at a discount, packaged them up, and sold thousands of holidays in weeks. By the late 1970s, Intersourn was growing faster than the charter seats available to fill its holidays. So Goodman did what any man of his particular disposition would do. He decided to build his own airline. In 1978, 2 former executives from Dan Air, Earl Cossey and Martin O'Regan, approached him with exactly that proposition. Goodman provided the financial backing. The working name was Inter-European Airways. But when the airline launched commercially on the 4th of May 1979, it carried a cleaner identity: Air Europe. That first flight departed London Gatwick bound for Palma de Mallorca in a Boeing 737-200. And already, from day one, Air Europe was doing something its rivals were not. Every passenger received a complimentary meal, not charged separately, included, on a charter flight. It sounds like a small thing. In the context of British budget aviation in 1979, it was a statement of intent. That almost never happens in aviation. Almost never. By 1982, the airline had opened bases at Manchester and Cardiff. The fleet was growing. Intersun was expanding, and Air Europe was the engine powering it. But there was a tension buried inside that efficiency that nobody spoke about too loudly. Air Europe's revenue was almost entirely dependent on one customer, its own parent company. If anything disrupted Intersun's bookings, there was no diversified base to fall back on. The airline and the tour operator were, in practical terms, two halves of the same financial body. In the early 80s, this barely mattered. The market was booming. In 1981, ILG International Leisure Group floated on the stock exchange, valued at £44 million. Goodman's empire was going public, and it looked glorious. But Goodman had a restless instinct. By the mid-80s, a different idea was forming. What if Air Europe stopped being just a charter carrier? What if it went up against the flag carriers on scheduled routes, direct competition with British Airways on the routes that actually mattered? In May 1985, Air Europe made its move. A regular timetabled route between Gatwick and Palma de Mallorca. Not a charter. A scheduled flight, where any passenger could book a seat without a package holiday attached. The kind of thing British Airways and its peers had always considered their territory. The response from the flag carriers was predictable. Polite contempt. Air Europe was a holiday airline. What was it doing playing in the grown-ups arena? The answer over the next 4 years was deeply uncomfortable for anyone who had underestimated them. The answer over the next 4 years was deeply uncomfortable for anyone who had underestimated them. By the summer of 1989, Air Europe was operating 150 scheduled services every week across 16 routes out of Gatwick. Paris, Rome, Amsterdam, Brussels, Madrid, Frankfurt. Direct competition with British Airways, KLM, Lufthansa, on their own routes at lower fares, with aircraft that were newer than anything the legacy carriers were putting on those sectors. Let that settle for a moment. A British charter airline started with a single 737 and a box of complimentary meals, was now flying more short-haul scheduled services out of Gatwick than any other airline. The fleet reflected this transformation. By the end of the decade, Air Europe was operating Boeing 757-200. They were also taking delivery of the brand new Fokker 100, a sophisticated regional jet. The inaugural commercial Fokker 100 service departed Gatwick for Brussels on the 4th of December, 1989. Load factors were excellent from day one. Pay close attention here, because what Air Europe was building in the late 1980s, high aircraft utilization, lower labor costs, frequent point-to-point scheduled services, was the model that EasyJet would launch on a mass scale. The model that Ryanair would weaponize through the 90s and 2000s. Air Europe was doing it first, a decade earlier, and it was working. By 1990, the airline held 20% of all slots at Gatwick and was handling over 5 million passengers annually. 2,000 people worked for it directly. It had stakes in Air Europe Italy, Air Europa in Spain, and had invested in Norway Airlines as part of a broader pan-European network strategy. But the structure was carrying more weight than most people on the outside understood. By the late 1980s, ILG had made a decision that looked like ambition but functioned more like overreach. Having competed successfully on short-haul scheduled routes, Goodman wanted the long haul. Transatlantic, Caribbean, Asia. The routes the big carriers flew and charged accordingly for. In 1989, Air Europe placed firm orders for up to 8 McDonnell Douglas the 1500th-11 aircraft, large, 3-engine wide-body jets designed for routes across the Atlantic and beyond. The financial commitment was substantial. The delivery dates stretched well into the 1990s. None of those aircraft would ever be delivered. Not one. At the same time, ILG's financial structure had evolved in a way that very few people outside the boardroom fully understood. The group had become increasingly dependent on the residual values of the aircraft it operated. In plain terms, the planes had become financial instruments, not just transport assets. and those planes were priced in US dollars. But Air Europe sold its tickets in British pounds. The moment the exchange rate moved against them, the moment fuel spiked, the moment demand fell, the gap between what those assets were worth on paper and what the company needed to function would become dangerous. The airline was undercapitalized for the ambition it was carrying. It was flying on debt, on leverage, on the assumption that growth would continue and that nothing unexpected would arrive. Then, on the 2nd of August 1990, Saddam Hussein ordered Iraqi forces across the border into Kuwait. The price of crude oil, sitting at around $17 a barrel in July, began climbing immediately. By September, it had passed $36. By October, it peaked at $46 a barrel. That is a rise of more than 170% in 3 months. Jet fuel prices rose by 78% during the same period. For an airline operating 31 aircraft, many of them on leases priced in US dollars, the timing could not have been more lethal. But the fuel cost was only one blade of the scissors. The other blade was the passengers. Or rather, the sudden, terrifying absence of them. When the invasion of Kuwait began, something happened across Europe that no airline had planned for. People stopped flying. They stopped because they were afraid. The television news was showing tanks, fires, and the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of troops across the Middle East. Nobody knew how far it would go. The Association of European Airlines recorded that only 1/3 of all international flight seats in Europe were being filled at the height of the crisis. 1/3. 2 out of every 3 seats on every scheduled flight were flying empty. British Airways lost passengers. KLM cut 2,000 jobs and announced losses of $130 million in a single quarter. Even the national carriers with government backing were struggling to stay upright. For Air Europe, no government safety net, no state equity, a balance sheet already stretched by years of aggressive expansion. This was not a manageable setback. It was an existential crisis arriving at full speed. If you were alive in Britain in 1990, you may remember the mood. There was a recession building already before the Gulf crisis. Interest rates were high. Consumer confidence was wobbling. The combination of economic anxiety at home and military uncertainty in the Middle East produced something particularly damaging: a collapse in forward holiday bookings. The numbers that came in for Air Europe were devastating. Passenger bookings for the 1991 summer season, the season that was supposed to be the biggest in the airline's history, had fallen by 55% compared to the previous year. More than half the expected passengers had simply not appeared on any booking system. And if you want to keep receiving stories like this one, real stories about British aviation and the companies that shaped this country's history, hit the subscribe button now. Leave a comment below telling us what you remember about Air Europe. It matters that these stories are told properly. ILG had accumulated debts of £500 million. The structure of the business, which had looked so elegant during the growth years, had become a trap. Every arm of the group was financially interconnected. When Air Europe's revenue collapsed, it dragged Intersun with it. When Intersun's bookings fell, it removed what little forward revenue Air Europe had left. There was no cushion. There was no reserve. There was no government phone call offering an emergency credit line. Harry Goodman had taken the group private in a leveraged buyout financed by debt, and that debt had never really gone away. It had simply been serviced by growth. When the growth stopped, the debt remained. The winter of 1990 to 1991 was one of the most difficult periods the British travel industry had ever faced. The Gulf War began in earnest on the 17th of January 1991. Travel ground close to a halt. Even Heathrow, one of the busiest airports on Earth, saw passenger numbers fall by 21%. For a company carrying £500 million of debt, it is simply a question of how long before the numbers stop adding up entirely. By the early months of 1991, that moment was approaching fast. The board of ILG knew it, the banks knew it, and the employees of Air Europe were beginning to sense that something was deeply wrong. The end came on the 8th of March, 1991. Managing Director Rod Lynch issued a statement. The language was measured and careful, in the way that announcements of complete catastrophe often are. We regret to announce that due to the company's uncertain situation, all services will be suspended until further notice. An application is being made to the High Court for the appointment of an administrative receiver. That was it. No rescue plan, no alternative carrier lined up, no government repatriation program in place, just a statement and silence. At airports across the Mediterranean, Mallorca, Tenerife, Corfu, British families stood at departure gates that would not open. 25,000 passengers stranded abroad. 4,000 people lost their jobs that morning. 2,000 of them were Air Europe employees directly. Check-in staff, cabin crew, engineers, pilots, ground handlers. The rest worked across ILG's wider operations. The aircraft were grounded, repossessed by their lessors within days. The slots at Gatwick, 20% of the entire airport's capacity, accumulated over more than a decade, were redistributed. The airline that had operated from those slots simply ceased to exist. The airline was genuinely ahead of its time. Air Europe was competing on scheduled routes with legacy carriers using lower costs and higher aircraft utilization. It was offering passengers frequency and modern aircraft on short-haul European routes. When EasyJet launched in October 1995, the strategic logic was recognizable to anyone who had followed Air Europe. When Ryanair transformed itself in the mid-90s, the template had been partially drawn already. The difference between Air Europe and those successors was not the idea. The idea was sound. The difference was capital structure. EasyJet launched with external equity and a focused model. The survivors of the budget revolution that followed did less. They did it more simply, and they survived because simplicity, in a crisis, is the only thing that holds. What Air Europe built did not disappear. What Air Europe built did not disappear. The pilots who flew the Fokker 100 went on to fly for other carriers. The engineers found work elsewhere. Some of the routes Air Europe pioneered are still being flown today. Harry Goodman himself remained connected to the travel industry in various capacities. He spoke publicly about his love for it, calling it, in a phrase that revealed a great deal about the man, his one lasting love affair. He died in 2018 at the age of 79. His obituary described him as one of the most influential figures in British travel over the previous 50 years. That description is accurate. Intersoon had made foreign holidays genuinely affordable for millions. Air Europe had shown that a British airline could challenge the flag carriers and win. The model was real. What Air Europe built did not vanish. It became the ground that others built on. There is a version of history in which Air Europe survives the Gulf War. It requires certain conditions. A less leveraged balance sheet going into 1990. A financial structure that kept the airline and the tour operator in separate silos, so that a collapse in Intersun's bookings did not simultaneously drain Air Europe's liquidity. A slightly smaller fleet order program, perhaps the MD-11 commitment deferred, perhaps the Fokker expansion scaled back, giving the group more breathing room in the event of a sudden revenue collapse. For the 2,000 people who arrived for work at Gatwick on that March morning and found a notice on the wall instead of a briefing schedule, this was not an aviation story. It was the morning their careers ended. Pilots who had spent years training for the 757. Cabin crew who had joined Air Europe precisely because it felt like a company going somewhere. Ground engineers who had taken pride in maintaining a fleet of modern aircraft. All of them found that the company they worked for had ceased to exist. Their stories rarely make it into the histories. The focus tends to settle on Harry Goodman, on the fleet orders. But the people who stood in foreign departure halls holding tickets for flights that no longer existed, they are part of this story too. And so are the passengers. Ordinary British families who had saved for their holidays and who deserved better than 4 lines of corporate language on a printed notice. If you have stayed with this story from the beginning, if you remember the Gatwick of the 1980s, if you ever booked an inter-sun holiday or stepped onto an Air Europe flight and noticed that it felt just a little more modern than what you might have expected, then you already understand something the business press at the time largely missed. Air Europe was not just another airline. It was a genuinely original attempt to reimagine what British aviation could be. And the passengers who flew with it were, in a real sense, voting for something. They were voting for an industry where the flag carriers did not have a monopoly on quality and frequency, where a British family could board a modern aircraft at Gatwick and be treated well without paying British Airways prices. Those votes were heard, just not for long enough. The story of Air Europe is, in the end, a story about the difference between having the right idea and having the financial foundation to see it through. About the cost of building on debt in an industry where the unexpected is always one season away. About what happens when ambition outruns capital, and a war nobody planned for arrives to collect the difference. But it is also a story about the people who built something real and ran it well, and saw it ended by circumstances that were only partly of their own making. The Gulf War did not create the vulnerability, it found it, and when it did, there was nothing left to hold the structure up. So the next time you find yourself at Gatwick, standing at a departure gate, boarding a flight to somewhere sunny, think for a moment about what it took to build that possibility. The companies that failed as well as the ones that survived. Air Europe got there first. It paid the price. It paid the price for being first. And the industry that came after it, the one that makes cheap flights so routine that we barely think about them anymore, was built in part on the foundations it laid. That is not a footnote. That is the story. If this video meant something to you, leave a comment below. Tell us what you remember. Like the video if it was worth your time. Share it with a friend. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the moment. There are more stories like this one waiting for you. This is the kind of history that deserves to be told properly.